I'm Sarah Glover, and I am a member of the Fine Arts Committee who is presenting this class today. It's Rain Gardens, and it is part of the Living Sustainability along the Lakeshore theme that some of our curriculum committees have been using this year for classes. Our presenter is Kelly Goward, who has a great deal of experience working for both the Ottawa-Allegan Conservation District and for the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council, which is located in Holland. She received a BS from GVSU and an MS from Ball State in Indiana, and currently serves as the Environmental Program Manager at MACC. MACC functions sort of like a committee that is made up of officials and representatives from the various municipalities and the entities within the Macatawa watershed. Decisions on transportation planning and on water quality are then made relative to this particular region. MACC encourages the cooperation among these municipalities and neighboring units. Kelly works as the Environmental Program Manager, whose primary focus is the Macatawa Watershed Project, which is 175 square miles of land that drains into Lake Macatawa. By reducing the sediment and phosphorus in the waters, this is the primary goal. And managing rainwater where it falls can be accomplished through a number of ways: rain barrels, native plants, planting trees, and yes, rain gardens, which can be accomplished at our own homes. Kelly will provide some overview and then work very specifically on how to design your own rain garden. So this will be an interactive, responsive sort of, as much as we can, presentation. So Kelly is going to continue, and please give her a welcome.
All right, virtual welcome. Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah, Susan, and Kim, and all the other program organizers for inviting me to do this program today. And thank you all for attending. It's good to see some familiar names and faces in the audience today. And thank you, Sarah, for that great introduction. I don't think there's anything I need to add there. I am going to be, sharing my screen and running through some PowerPoint slides and kind of moving back and forth between some different documents. But before we get started into the presentation, I want to just do a quick review of the program handouts that were provided. So hopefully you received a mailed copy of this workbook. If you did not, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. So there is also, if you received an email with a digital copy of the slides, hopefully, and then a link to a Google Drive. So the Google Drive does have a copy of this workbook in it if you want a digital copy, and you can follow along on your computer. The digital version is fillable, so there are fields within the document so you can type into it instead of having to print and write on it if you prefer to work off of the computer. So that link is in the chat, and then we will, probably toward the end of the presentation, I will kind of do a little overview of those materials that are in that Google Drive. It's just a bunch of resources that hopefully will help you in your planning or help you to learn more about native plants or rain gardens in general. Like it was mentioned, this is a workshop I typically do in person, and I like it to be very interactive. So hopefully we can still get some of that in this virtual format. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure everybody had that workbook. So we will kind of pause at certain points, and I will ask you to, turn to a page in the workbook and take a few minutes to, think about some things and maybe jot down some ideas. And then certainly want to be, taking questions throughout. So if you have any questions that you think of and you want to, put them in the chat right away, certainly do that. But I will, pause at certain points, and you can use the raise hand feature in the chat window, and I'll call on you if you want to ask your question out loud. All right, so with the introduction out of the way, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. Okay. All right, so here's just kind of a quick outline of what I'm planning to run through today. Let me see, I'm going to change my view here so I can still see you guys while I'm presenting. Okay. So we're going to kind of take a couple minutes to go through some definitions and a little bit of background to make sure we're all on the same page with some of the terminology. And then we're really going to focus today mostly on this planning process and going through in detail the steps that you should go through when you plan a rain garden. And then we will look at some specific native plant species. There's a lot out there. I certainly have some favorites that I will share with you, and we'll kind of talk about the ins and outs of some, species, and then how you can narrow down and make your species selection. And then at the end, I do want to talk to you a little bit about a program that we are developing in the Macatawa watershed called Rainscaping that relates back to rain gardens and other practices. So first, let's kind of go through some basic definitions here. And I want to take us all back to, maybe 4th grade when you first learned the water cycle. So hopefully you remember some of these terms, but this really sets the stage for why rain gardens are so important. Let me get my little pointer here. So the basics of the water cycle, we've got liquid water on the surface that turns into a gas through a process of evaporation. Water also leaves vegetation as a gas through a process called transpiration. So we tend to lump those together into evapotranspiration. So once we have water vapor in the air, it will condense into clouds and then falls to the surface as precipitation. So then what happens when it's on the surface is really what we're most concerned about. There's 2 pathways that water will take. In a natural setting, we tend to get lots of infiltration. So that's water soaking into the ground. And then the other pathway is running off the surface and then directly into a water body. When we have lots of infiltration, that means most of that water is going into groundwater. And then we have a nice steady flow of groundwater that feeds our streams. So we have constantly flowing streams. So this is the preferred natural cycle. But in many places, Holland certainly is no exception. We have altered this water cycle tremendously through development. So as we cut down trees and pave surfaces, we alter the water cycle significantly. And again, we're really most concerned about these processes of what happens to water once it hits the ground. So because we've paved a lot of the surface, there's a lot less infiltration because there just isn't that opportunity, and we get more runoff. And so there are consequences to that. One being less infiltration means there's less groundwater flow. And then less groundwater means that our streams aren't being constantly fed. So we tend to see what we call flashy streams. They may tend to dry up when there isn't a lot of rain, but they will fill up very quickly when there is rain because most of that water is going as runoff. And then certainly as the more runoff is flowing off of our impervious surfaces like roads and parking lots, it's picking up pollution as well. So not only do we have a problem with the quantity and flow of water, but then we also have pollution that's delivered. So then really with rain gardens and other practices, what we're trying to do is make this urban water cycle behave a little bit more like the natural water cycle. And we'll get more into that on the next couple slides. So at kind of a high level, there is a kind of a group of practices known as green stormwater infrastructure. So these are practices that we can put on the landscape that help to mimic that natural water cycle. So it's a variety of things that will help to increase infiltration, so kind of capturing stormwater and infiltrating it into the ground and decreasing that runoff. So we're making that urban environment behave more like a natural environment. And so there's a lot of different kinds of practices. I put just a few examples here that in a more commercial or industrial setting are highly engineered. And so things like permeable pavement, bioretention, a green roof or rainwater harvesting system. This photo here is from the downtown market in Grand Rapids. And so they have multiple practices on site that they're using to manage stormwater. So they do have a green roof on most of the building. They do have this a rainwater harvesting system. So what rainwater is not used by the plants on the green roof goes into this cistern that's then used to irrigate their landscape. They do have bioretention in their parking lot as well. So it's a really great example, pretty neat features to see that most people would not necessarily pay attention to, but they're there to help manage the stormwater. Again, highly engineered, very specialized, pretty expensive for the most part. But then we have this kind of subset of green stormwater infrastructure practices that have are starting to be known as rainscaping that are easier to use in a residential setting. So these are more kind of DIY, do it yourself kinds of projects that will accomplish the same goal of slowing down stormwater, spreading it out and soaking it in. So we're getting that infiltration, we're helping to reduce the runoff. So certainly today we're going to focus on rain gardens, but I did want to mention there are certainly some other practices that can be used at home. So rain barrels, that's not going to infiltrate water, but we're going to capture runoff and keep it from running off. That can either be used to, water your landscape or gardens, or you can let it slowly infiltrate later. Just converting your lawn to native plants or planting trees helps to manage stormwater. And then riparian buffer strips are kind of specialized vegetation that you would put adjacent to a stream. So riparian just means the land adjacent to a stream or a lake. So again, kind of replacing the turf grass with native plants or trees that can better manage that stormwater and help it to infiltrate. All right, I haven't seen any questions at this point on some of these general concepts?
I don't see anything in the chat, Callie.
Okay, perfect. All right, so before we get into rain gardens, let's take a minute to talk about rain gardens and what they are. So we, again, have the same baseline understanding. So a rain garden is essentially just a depressed area in the landscape that collects rainwater from any number of impervious surfaces. It could be from your roof, from the driveway, but the key here is that it allows that water to soak into the ground. So we're infiltrating stormwater. In most cases, rain gardens are going to use native plants, which for one, have much deeper root systems than your traditional landscape plants, but then they also need less care. They don't need to be irrigated. You don't need to use pesticides and fertilizers to maintain them. So you get multiple benefits there. They're more water efficient. They're less harmful on the environment. There are some other benefits that we can get from rain gardens in terms of helping to reduce flooding on the property. If you have a low wet spot that tends to flood all the time, that may be an appropriate place to put a rain garden. Or you can divert water away from your house using a downspout and put it into a rain garden. And then there certainly are ancillary benefits like providing habitat for pollinators, for butterflies, for birds. All right, so now we are going to get into the planning process. So we're going to go through these 6 steps of the planning process in detail. And this is where at certain points I will point out pages in your workbook, and we won't stop and do all of them, but we'll just kind of point out the processes, and then at some points there are a couple that we will stop and I'll have you spend some time on your workbooks. And certainly feel free to be, jotting your thoughts down as we go. So step 1 is evaluating your land. And I don't think I should have put page numbers in the workbook, but it's basically the first page after the cover sheet. has these same set of questions on it. So this is kind of a really good place to start, is to really take stock of what is happening on your property, what exists on your property. And this is something that you wouldn't want to just necessarily do at one point in time. You might want to do it at different points of the year, so you can observe, you know, where does water flow on your property? You're going to see that best when it's raining. Are there problem areas where water stands or ponds after a rain event? You're going to need to wait till after the rain. So you might want to take, you know, some time to do this evaluation process, you know, over a few days, over a few months even, to make sure you have a good understanding of what's happening on your property. And then are some other pieces that it's more than just observation. You may have to do a little investigation. And so we'll get into some of the soil investigation pieces next. And one good way to kind of start this is to do a sketch of your property. So it's actually on the, I guess it's the 4th page technically of your workbook. After you get past the goals and objectives, there is a blank page basically for a site sketch. And if you don't have the workbook, you can just obviously use a blank piece of paper. But I did want to pause here for a minute and, you know, give you a chance to, you know, do a little sketch of your property. Just to, you know, start with the existing features, your house, your garage, the driveway, porches, you know, where do you have existing landscape features, landscape beds, gardens? Where are your trees? Where, you know, do you have a fence line? Are there any overhead or underground utilities? So it's kind of a good place to start, is sketch your land as it is. And then as you do your evaluation, you can start to make notes on that sketch. And I would recommend, with doing your evaluation, you know, start with your site sketch, or maybe you do your sketch as you're walking around the property, you know, so grab a pencil and a clipboard and take a walk around the property, and sketch things as you go. So yeah, again, feel free if you want to draw your sketch. I'm going to keep talking, but go ahead and do that. So some of the other things that you'd want to investigate and know about your property are the soil type and the sunlight exposure. So I'm going to talk about sunlight first, because we've got several things we're going to talk about with soil. So sunlight is important for your plant selection. Plants have preferences for certain kinds of sunlight, and we sometimes refer to that as their shade tolerant. So if they are shade intolerant, it means they need full sunlight. And if you have a yard full of trees that shades your yard all day long, you're not going to be able to put plants that are shade intolerant. So making sure you're selecting the right species for your condition are really important to make sure that your plants will survive. And native plant catalogs are really great resources to give you that information about plants, what their preferences are. And at the end, we'll take a look at some of those resources. So sunlight is really important for your plant selection. The other factor that's really important for plant selection is the soil type. And soil type will also give us an idea of how suitable a rain garden may or may not be on your property, because not all soils are created equal. Some may be prohibitive for having rain gardens because they don't allow water to infiltrate. There's some characteristic of the soil that would not allow it to infiltrate. And the things that we're most interested in the soil type is the texture of the soil, which is it sand, loam, clay, has to do with the size of the soil particles. And then the drainage, how quickly is water draining through the soil? And so there's a couple different resources for that. And I'm actually going to exit out of the presentation, and I'm going to show you the Web Soil Survey website. And then I'll follow up and put some instructions in the Google folder if you want to go back to the website, because there are no instructions in the workbook for how to do this. But I'm going to show you the website, and then there's a couple different home soil tests that you can do that we'll talk about after we look at the website. So the web soil survey, the easiest way to find it is just to search for web soil survey, and you can do it all as one word. And then you get to this website and you just click the green button. Oops. I'm trying to start a new session. Okay. So before you click that green button, there further down on the website, it gives you the instructions that I'm going to walk you through, the 4 basic steps of defining your area, clicking on the soil map, and then exploring the data. So this is what it looks like when you click on that green button, and you've got all these various tools here that you can zoom in and out. You can pan on the map. So it defaults to this zoom, so you can zoom in. So you can just draw a little box and it'll zoom in to a location, but you can also just put your address in this little box here. You can go to the county, you can, there's various, the section, township, range, there's various ways that you can navigate, but probably easiest just to navigate by your address. So I'm going to just put in our office address, which has very boring soils on it, but just to give you a sense of, here's where our office is located. It gives you that little bullseye on the screen. And so once you navigate to your area, you use these little buttons here that say AOI, it stands for area of interest. And you can either draw a rectangle or you can draw kind of a free-form polygon around the property. Probably a rectangle is going to work best for most people. And so I'm going to just draw a rectangle kind of in this neighborhood behind our office, because the soils are a little bit more interesting there. And so you draw your rectangle and then you just see this kind of cross hatch on the map. And so this just indicates that's the area you just defined. So to see the information about the soils, you would click on this little tab here that says soil map. And so now it's going to give you this map that shows you different soil types. And then there's a legend on the left-hand side that tells you what those soil types are. So we can get one piece of information from this, and that's the texture. So we've got a loamy sand, here's a sand, here's a sand. And so if we click on each one of these, you can see they're hyperlinks. So you can click on each one of those and it'll give you more information about that soil. And so there's a lot of information here. You can spend a lot of time exploring this data, but what we're really looking for here is under the properties and qualities, there's a drainage class. So this particular soil, this au gray loamy sand, is somewhat poorly drained. So to me, that indicates that might not be the best place for a rain garden, because we want to find a site that has good drainage. We want that infiltration. So somewhat poorly drained indicates that soil is not naturally going to drain very well. So in contrast to a plain field sand, that drainage class is excessively drained. So that means water is going to leave that soil very quickly, and maybe too quickly. You might need to amend the soil to add some compost to, provide your plants with some water holding, some nutrients. So this is kind of one way that you can find out some information about the soil that's mapped on your property. Certainly soils are altered in construction processes. So this is not necessarily the only way that you should investigate your soils, but this is a starting point. And again, I will, in that Google folder, I'll put a document in there that has some instructions for how to do this, because it can get a little complicated, and there's a lot more on this website that you can explore, but at the basic level, that's really all you need to look at is what's the natural drainage class of your soil. Okay, so then going back to the presentation here. So a couple other things that you can do at home that are relatively easy and might be pretty fun to do. There is a jar test that you can do to determine your soil texture. And so there is a handout in the Google folder that has more instructions for how to do this. But at its basic level, you get a soil sample, you put it in a jar with some water and like a drop of dish soap. You shake it up, and then you wait for the soil particles to settle out. So the biggest, heaviest particles will settle out first, and then the finer particles will settle out last. And you may need to let this sit for 24 hours or so before all those particles settle out. And then within the handout, it provides instructions for how to measure these layers and then determine what the soil texture is. The second at-home test is a percolation test, and this helps you determine the rate of infiltration for your soil. So again, there's a handout in that Google folder, but again, at its basic, you dig a hole, fill it up with water, measure it, and then time how long it takes the water to soak into the soil. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basics of it. And so then you'll end up with, how many inches per hour is water moving into the soil. So those, I'll show you at the end where those handouts are located. Do we have any questions at this point? I'm going to open up the chat just in case. Okay, I don't see any in the chat. I don't see anybody's hands up either. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you look at the moisture, and again, I haven't done any tests yet, but if you look at the amount of moisture or how wet your property is, where you're thinking about a rain garden, and it's an area that gets a lot of runoff, and that'd be the area I'd be interested in. But is it that it doesn't drain well, or because it constantly is getting runoff, it stays wet? Does that make sense?
Right. Yep. And that's where, doing, a little bit of investigation would help you determine maybe, is it the percolation rate? Is it, if you have a lot of fine textured particles in the soil, there may be some, restrictive nature that's causing it to not drain well. Maybe it is draining well, it's just gets water all the time. So you can still do those tests at home to see what the results are of that. And certainly, there's ideal situations as far as the more sandy soil certainly is better suited for rain gardens because it has a quicker infiltration rate and that higher percolation rate. But you can still do rain gardens in finer textured soils with lower percolation. You just may need more design, a little more complex design, potentially even, an under drain system in it, which at that point you might want to consult with a professional kind of landscape designer that could help you kind of do that investigation and figure out the best way to proceed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that was kind of the basics of your site investigation or property evaluation. So then next, it's really looking at, what are your goals and objectives for the property? And I would even challenge you kind of beyond thinking about rain gardens, but certainly in the specific context of rain gardens, your goal is kind of that big picture. What do you want to achieve? What are you hoping to achieve by putting in a rain garden? Is that you want to manage rainwater? Do you have a wet spot that you want to fix? Or do you have some other reason? And it could be you have more than one. And that's perfectly acceptable. It could be you just want to improve the aesthetics and thought a rain garden would be one way you could do that. So you can have multiple goals to achieve or that a rain garden would help fulfill. But then your objectives, in contrast to your goals, the objectives are more specific. So it's what do you want to do and when do you want to do it by? So we want those to be specific, measurable, and have some kind of a completion date in mind. So I want to install a rain garden in the southwest corner of my property in this May. So that's very specific. It's measurable, so we know if we've achieved it or not, and it has that time frame. So there is a page in the worksheet or in the workbook where you can jot down your goals and objectives. And so I did want to pause at this point and give you a minute to do that and see if anyone has a goal for their property or some objectives that they'd like to share with the group. And you can either pop those in the chat, or if you want to share them out loud, you are welcome to do that as well. It's a pretty quiet group.
That does happen sometimes. And also just remember, if you do have something to say, don't be shy, and also just unmute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the interaction on this one is going to be more fun.
Okay, we've got a little action in the chat here.
On the site you showed us where you can find, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, I'm curious how in the map you showed us where you can figure out what your soil type is. How on earth do they know what all the soil types are in all those areas?
Mm-hmm. Yep, so that's a very good question. So those soil maps were created by it's the United States Department of Agriculture, and they actually, I forget when they were doing this, they actually sent out crews to sample the soil, and they basically went out on a grid all over the landscape and took soil samples to determine those characteristics. And soils take a long time to change. Soils aren't altered naturally very quickly. So even though the soil survey data is, I think it's maybe 70, 80 years ago that a lot of that data was collected, and it certainly took decades to collect. So yeah, it was actually done in the field by taking samples.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so it looks like we've got a couple people have wet spots in their yard they want to fix, expanding a butterfly garden, adding rain barrels. That's great. Okay. All right, so then once you've evaluated your property, you've determined what your goals and objectives are, then it's time to start developing a plan. And I would certainly encourage you to take some time to do the evaluation and think about your goals and objectives, and put your plan together. You may get through this process pretty quick and you know exactly what you want, but certainly don't rush through it because you just want to get something done. Take the time to really think it out and plan what you want to do, because then you're more likely to be successful and happy with the result in the end. So really, with developing your plan, it kind of starts back with your site sketch. So hopefully you've already started a site sketch when you've done your evaluation, and then you can start to add some of the features, or sketch out where you want that rain garden to go, or if you want to put in rain barrels or other sorts of things. So let's talk a little bit about locations and how to properly locate your rain garden. So again, hopefully you have your sketch. So the first thing we want to make sure is that we are far enough away from existing features on your landscape. so we don't cause problems. So number one, with any, with your buildings, especially with, foundations and basements, we want to make sure a rain garden is at least 15 feet away. We don't want to put a rain garden right up next to the house, because remember, the point of a rain garden is to infiltrate water. So we don't want that to infiltrate right next to your foundation and end up in your basement. So that's number one, make sure you get it far enough away from the house. Another location to avoid would be underneath the canopy of a tree. Because in most cases, you're going to do some excavation, some digging of your rain garden, and we want to avoid causing damage to existing tree roots. So on your site sketch, you can kind of start to envision maybe, what are the areas you need to avoid, and then see kind of what's left over where you've got room to put in a rain garden. And so then hopefully you've done your soil investigation, and you know what the sunlight is like in that spot. So then that will help you on the kind of the next step to pick out plants. But before we get to the plants, we need to figure out, how big does this rain garden need to be? Or how big do you want it to be? So there's kind of two differences there, right? So some of it may be, the size is going to be limited based on your space. But we do want to make sure that it's adequately sized for the amount of water that it will be accepting. So we're going to look at that on the next slide, and there's a worksheet in your workbook for that. And then the other things that we'll talk about is, what plants, so how do you pick your plants? And then thinking about other features you might want in your rain garden, especially if you're going to be having a dual purpose, like maybe it's going to be a butterfly garden. There are other features for butterflies you might want to include, like butterflies need to have a puddling area where they can drink minerals, either from, from a mud puddle or from a rock. So are there other features you want to put in your garden? And then make sure you put those on your plan as well. All right, so I see a question that I'm going to address right now that's in the chat about rain gardens located between the sidewalk and the street. So that is the city right away. And so the MAC is working with the City of Holland on some of those projects that are happening in conjunction with road reconstruction. So 4 went in on 19th Street. I guess it was 2019. And then last year in 2020, we had 5 installed on 20th and 21st Street as part of those projects. So those are designed, if you put them in that location, they're designed to accept water off the street. So then there certainly is a lot of coordination that you have to do with the city on that. And the city is approaching those projects right now, I guess from an opportunistic perspective. If they're going to be doing a project anyway, then it's easy to leave that opening in the curb to allow water to go in so we can put in a rain garden. The city is probably not going to be as open to putting rain gardens on streets that are not having road construction, because then, you can do it, but the existing curb has to be cut, and then excavation on one project, kind of outside of a road construction project, is going to be much more costly. I don't think the city would outright say no to that, but it's going to take some time to figure out the details and determine if and when the city would allow that. And the way that the city has been approaching these rain gardens with the road projects is that the maintenance responsibility is that of the homeowner. So if you're willing to take on the expense and the time to install and maintain it, the city might be willing to work with you on a rain garden in that location. But overall, I'd say it's probably best to avoid that and just stick with something on your own property. Okay, so let's look at rain garden sizing. So you can do kind of a, guess and check method where we figure out, you know, how much water is coming off your roof, and then you just kind of see how big you can make your rain garden. Or you can actually go through a little bit more technical process, which is the worksheet page. And I am going to, let's see if I can pull that up here. So this page in the workbook has some I guess some easier conversions, so you don't have to go through all of the mathematical conversion steps. And so this is actually taken out of one of the resource guides that's in that Google folder that I'll show you later. But the way that this is set up in the fillable form is that if you put in the length and width of your contributing area, so this is the impervious surface that water is coming off of, that it's going to go into your garden, all the rest of these numbers will automatically populate. So you don't have to do the math. If you're going to print it out and do it by hand, then you're going to have to do the math. So the first thing you need to think about is this contributing area? Is it going to be water off of your roof? And if so, how much of your roof and what are the dimensions? Is it water off the driveway? You know, what are the dimensions? So just to kind of show an example here, if we had a roof that was, you know, 20 feet by 40 feet wide, so we've got 800 square feet, and it automatically populates all these numbers. So what these are based on is two factors. One is the percolation rate of your soil. So if you've done that percolation test, you can, you know, get it a little bit more precise, but this gives you some general percolation rates. So a sandy soil is probably going to have a percolation rate of greater than 1 inch per hour. And if you just use an inch, that's going to be adequate. For some of your finer textured soils, the silty loamy, more like 0.5 inches per hour. And so instead of going through all of the mathematical calculations, there's just a conversion factor here. But it depends on how deep you want your garden to be. How much excavation work do you want to do? So if you have a 1/2 inch percolation rate and you want to do a 6-inch deep garden, it needs to be 160 square feet to capture all the water coming off of, you know, this roof area. If you want to do the same garden in a higher percolation soil, it can be 1/2 as big. So there's several factors that go into here, but it kind of gives you an easy conversion and relatively, you know, quick way to determine an appropriate size for your rain garden. And it, you know, running through these scenarios may help you kind of determine what size you want to have. You know, maybe you have space to do you know, 160 square foot, 6-inch deep garden, but maybe you don't. Maybe you only have about 100 square feet. So then you're going to need to dig that rain garden deeper. So this is, you know, it gives you some exact numbers, but there's still some wiggle room here for you to play with. And then ultimately what you'd want to do is, you know, determine how deep your rain garden is going to be, match it up with the percolation rate. And then, you know, once you pick your square footage, then you can kind of play with your dimensions, right? So if we had an 80 square foot garden, that could be an 8 foot by 10 foot garden. Or if you want to, you know, do some more math and figure out, you know, what the diameter of a circle would be to get you to 80 square feet, you can do some more math there. So there's some simple math we can do by just filling out this worksheet, or if you want to make it more complicated to get a different size rain garden, you certainly can. So does that all make sense? Any questions about kind of running through this calculation? Okay.
Kelly, it looks like you're managing the chat really effectively. I just wanted to make sure that the questions about the butterfly garden, the filter water to Lake Mac were answered, or that you saw those, because I heard you answer the one about the street and the sidewalk.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Those were, yep.
A while back. Okay. Thank you.
By depth, this is Jean. By depth, do you mean how low down you dig, or is that how far the top of it is below the surface of the lawn?
Right, so that would be, I guess you can kind of think of it from the bottom of your rain garden to the top of the rain garden. So how much water capacity you would have. So you
So
may
that
have
is
to,
that is how far you dig down,
right,
basically? Okay,
yeah, so basically, I mean, there's some little nuances there, but yeah, essentially it would be how far you dig.
okay.
Mhm.
Is the top surface below the surface of the lawn? I mean, if it's sunken, it has to be a little lower down, right? Or not really?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because you would, yeah, I mean, so there's certainly some nuances there. Because you'd want it to be, I guess it's that the inches are the capacity, how much water can it hold? So, you know, if you want 6 inches of water, you're probably going to have to dig it a little bit deeper than 6 inches to allow for the inlet, which we'll talk about that, you know, how water is going to get into it, and then a safe outlet. We want to have, you know, that 6 inches of ponding. And with rain gardens, when we really say ponding, I mean, it's temporary. We don't want water to be in that garden for a long period of time. But it needs to have that capacity. So if we have a rain event, it's holding that water temporarily. So we want it to make sure it's big enough to hold that amount of water that would be coming off the roof. And again, this is in that one of the resources in the Google folder, and I think it goes into a little bit more detail about how much, like how many inches of rain this equates to. And I don't remember that off the top of my head, but there are more details in it's the Iowa Rain Garden Manual. I'll show you at the end. Okay. Oops, okay, let's go back here. Okay. All right, so then the next thing is plant selection. So we have an idea of how big our garden needs to be. So now let's get down into the plant selection. So in the next page in your workbook, there's some kind of questions here to help you think through your plant selection. So number one, you want to think back to your goals and objectives. And if you had any specific about, butterflies, pollinators, things like that, make sure that you're, thinking about those. Do you have any personal preferences for flower color, for height? Do you have a preferred height range? Or do you want really tall plants so you can block out your neighbors? Are you concerned about things like deer or rabbits getting into your gardens? If it's going to be close to the road or the driveway, do you use salt? You need to find some salt tolerant plants. And certainly don't forget about your soil and sunlight conditions. So there is the worksheet there to kind of help you think through some of those. And once you kind of have your criteria narrowed down, then there's a bunch of resources that you can go to kind of develop your list of plant species. And again, toward the end, I will share some of those resources with you. I'll show you where they are in the Google folder. But there are some websites, some native plant websites that you can go to and put in your criteria, and it will give you a list. Or I do have a spreadsheet if you like to play around with spreadsheets, and you can sort and by your criteria and come up with your own kind of customized plant list that way. But there are a lot of resources that help you learn about these qualities of plants so that you can find the ones that will meet your criteria and your property conditions. So then this is, I think, kind of the fun part. Once you've got it all figured out, what you want is figuring out your plant map. How do you want to lay out your garden? Which if you want to plant a rain garden with a seed mix, then you don't need to do a plant map. But rain gardens are probably, more commonly planted with plugs or potted plants, certainly going to establish quicker and be able to handle, accepting rain quicker than if you were to put seeds in. You can certainly do a rain garden with seeds, but if you were going to do a seeded planting, I would make sure that water isn't directed to that rain garden until those plants are established. And we'll talk a little bit more about seeds and plants in the next couple slides, but again, this to me is kind of one of the fun things. I've done several of these plant maps for various homeowners, and it's just kind of playing around with the arrangement. And you can certainly I guess, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. If, somebody that has a landscape architect background may disagree with that, but if you're going to use native plants, they're very forgiving and they look good, together almost no matter how you arrange them. I mean, there are some certain things you want to keep in mind. And one is, how are you going to view the garden? Is there a back of the garden or is there a center of the garden? Where you'd want to put your taller plants so they're not obscuring the short plants. So thinking about, based on your heights of your plants, where do you want to put those tall and short plants? And then you're also going to want to consider the mature size of the plants, because when you get them, they're all going to be the same size, but some need more space than others. And we'll talk about some of those when we get into the native plants, but this is another place where a native plant catalog comes in really handy, that it will tell you how high it gets and also how wide it gets or its spread. So some plants, a lot of sedges stay pretty small. They only need about 1 square foot, but there's other things like prairie dropseed that need about, it needs about 3 square feet of space. They get pretty big. And then certain species, you may want to include them, but they can be aggressive. Anything in the mint family is going to be aggressive and spread. So you might want to make sure that's in the middle if you don't want it to spread. So you really need to know your plants in order to, really do a good plant map. But there are also lots and lots of resources out there that already have, these plant maps developed. And if you just do a Google search for native plant garden, native rain garden, you'll find a bunch of these. And so one that I have here, this is does not use native species, and I know you probably can't see all the details there, but if you find a garden layout that you like, you can always just substitute in native species that are similar. So something else about your rain garden design. So in the workbook, there's a plant map, a grid where if you want, you can sketch out your plant map and start to use a scale so how. I guess the ultimate goal of having the plant map is so you know how many plants you actually need to buy. On the next page in the workbook, there's just kind of a place for plant map notes. And there's also a couple questions about how will water enter the garden? So that's your inlet. And how will excess water leave the garden? That's your outlet. So you need to be thinking about these things in your design. So how will water come in to your garden? So in a lot of cases, we may be taking water from a downspout and directing it into a rain garden. And remember I had said that your rain garden should be about 15 feet from the house. This one in the picture here doesn't look like it's quite that far away, but it's a general idea here. So, you can put a surface downspout extender. You can put an underground pipe like this to get the water into your garden, but thinking about how the water is going to get in. And then the important thing with that is making sure that that inlet is armored, because you're going to have water coming in that has some energy to it. And we want to dissipate that energy using rocks or patio bricks, something like that, so that the water doesn't come just streaming in there and blow out your plants. So typically there'd be some kind of rocks at the inlet. So you can see there's some various examples here in this diagram. So this diagram here it shows like an underground pipe coming out into rocks, or you can do a surface channel, make like a little river rock channel from your downspout into the garden. And you could either, line that with something permeable so all the water gets to the garden, or water can infiltrate as on its way to the garden. So there's several different ways that you can do this, with the keys being that it needs to be protected. It needs to be protected somehow with something like rocks, so that the energy of the water is being dissipated as it gets into the garden. And then the other piece of this is the outlet. So if your garden were to fill up with water, how is it going to get out? Because we want to make sure that water doesn't come back into your inlet. So that's number one, your outlet. So in this diagram here, we want to make sure our outlet is lower than the inlet. So it basically, like here at its simplest, you can just build up a berm with some of the soil that you excavated out of your rain garden. And it basically provides it's like a lip on a cup. So if the rain garden fills up, it's got a lip that it can spill over and then out into your grass, perhaps. We want to make sure that doesn't go, into your neighbor's basement or damage any other property. So making sure you think about how's water going to get in and how's water going to get out if it fills up. Any questions about that? There's a little bit to that, and there's several different ways you can do that, but okay. All right, so then step 4 is your actual implementation. So that really starts with your site preparation. So assuming in most cases, you're going to have to remove or kill the existing vegetation. In a lot of the cases that we've worked on, it's turf grass, right? We're removing lawn so we can put in a rain garden. And which, if that's the case, typically you can just mechanically remove that grass because you're going to have to do excavation for your rain garden anyway. And one important point here is if you are doing excavation and digging, you should call Miss Dig first to have them come out and mark any utilities, especially if you're unsure that any underground utilities exist. So you can either call 811 or you can go to their website and fill out a form to request that through their website. And it's usually a relatively quick process, but a really critical step that you shouldn't skip. So one note here about kind of your excavation and digging, the more you disturb the soil, the more likely you are to activate dormant weed seeds. So be a little bit careful about that. I mean, if your soil hasn't been disturbed for a long time, there could be weed seeds that are in there that are just waiting for that disturbance. So if you have the time and you're willing to kind of be patient and wait, you can start your site preparation, say in the fall, and then plan your rain garden in the spring, so that in the spring you can see if new weeds come up and you can take care of them before you actually put the plants in the ground. Or you could start your preparation and weeding in the spring and make sure you've got good weed control all summer and put your plants in the fall. So don't skip on the site prep. And then you may also need to, at this point, this is when you want to consider if you need any soil amendments. So if you want to, add some sand in the soil to increase your infiltration, or maybe you want to add compost because you've got really sandy soils that need a little bit of a nutrient boost. You'd want to do that at this point. And so when you start considering soil amendments, that means that your excavation is going to be deeper because you have to work that material into the native soil. So you're not just talking a 6-inch rain garden. You may need to go down, a foot or so, 1.5 feet even, to get those amendments mixed into the soil. And then once you do that mixing of the amendments, you're going to want to make sure you kind of reestablish a firm, not a compact, but a firm planting bed. So the soil doesn't kind of settle and, your plants don't have a firm planting bed to go into. And so again, this is certainly, we say, you know, like rain gardens is a do-it-yourself project, it still takes quite a bit of work. So if this is, you know, to this point, if you need the excavation, if you need soil amendments, there are certainly companies, contractors that can help you do this part of it. And, you know, there are some that we've worked with in the area. We're working on getting a list of those together, but can certainly, if you're interested in something sooner rather than later, I can get you some referrals to some companies. So then the planting itself, talked a little bit about seeds already. I would not recommend seeds in a rain garden because they take longer to establish. There's more competition from weeds, and there's less control over where the plants go. It is a lot cheaper than purchasing plants, however. So the plugs establish quickly, they can handle some weed competition, and you have complete control over where those plants end up. It is going to cost you a little bit more. I haven't priced out seeds in a long time, but generally most native plants you can get, you kind of plan for like $2 to $3 per square foot of your rain garden. It really just depends on what species you want and how many of those. So, you know, the smaller the species, as far as you need more of them, obviously that will cost more than if you get big species that take up more space. And then timing, if you're going to put seeds in the ground, you can do spring or fall. Grasses germinate better in the spring, wildflowers germinate better in the fall, because wildflower seeds need to go through cold stratification over the winter months, which you can, you know, sometimes force that if you put them in the freezer. But again, I would not recommend doing seeds. The plugs you can either do in the spring or fall. So this is where you've got those options to start your site preparation in one of those seasons and then do your planting the following season. These are warm season plants, so you don't plant them typically as early as you might some of the other typical landscape plants. So right around Memorial Day is a good time to plant, kind of mid-May to mid-June, or then in the fall, you can also plant mid-September to mid-October. And then we would recommend mulch in the rain garden, you know, 2-3 inches, at least for the first year, to help get those plants established, help retain moisture in the soil. When you use mulch in a rain garden, you want to use something that isn't going to float away when the rain garden fills up. So shredded hardwood mulch is the best for that. If you put in wood chips, the first time it rains, it'll just still float up to the surface and wash out of your rain garden. So make sure you use the shredded hardwood mulch. All right, so we're almost through the steps here. The last two are fairly quick. So monitor and maintain. Again, really important to make sure that you're maintaining your rain garden so it continues to function. And so a lot of the maintenance is going to be, you know, checking for weeds. And then the first couple of years, you may need to do some supplemental watering while those plants are getting established. I mean, they're babies. They need a little bit of care the first couple of years before you can let them go on their own. And so within the, oh, and I guess I neglected to mention, in the workbook, there is a kind of a worksheet for implementation to get you thinking about, you know, what methods are you going to use, when are you going to do the planting, and how to calculate the mulch. We won't go through that together. But then on the monitor and maintain page, again, there's some questions there to get you thinking about your maintenance. But on the bottom of the workbook, it gives you some of the typical maintenance that you would do in a rain garden. And so most of this is no different than any other perennial garden that you might have. The big difference is that you need to check your inlet and your outlet and make sure that water has a way to get in and a way to get out, that your inlet's not blocked, your outlet's not blocked. And so that might be that, you know, if you've got trees, you've got leaf litter that's accumulated and blocking your inlet. So that's really the extra maintenance is checking your inlet and your outlet. Otherwise, the rest of the maintenance is just like any other perennial garden: weeding, deadheading, removing the thatch. These are perennial plants, so they're gonna, die back at the top and regrow from their root system every year. So it's basically perennial garden maintenance. All right, and then the last step is just kind of evaluating and measuring your success. Did you meet your goals? What worked well, what didn't work well? What would you do differently next time? What lessons did you learn that you might want to, share with your neighbors? So that's another important part to, not skip. To make sure that you're happy with it, because if you're not happy with it, then you need to go back to some other, earlier in the planning process and make some adjustments. So there's a couple more things I want to mention, and then we can see if there's some additional questions. Some things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through the planning process. Might be a good idea to have a chat with your neighbors at some point before you just start excavating and put plants in the ground, because they probably are going to notice what you're doing and going to want to know what's going on. So the earlier you talk to them, the better. And maybe you can even get them interested in, collaborating with you on doing a rain garden. But I think one of the biggest things that we hear from people is, because native plants don't look always prim and proper, right? Like a traditional landscape. So the biggest complaint you're going to get is, what are you letting all those weeds grow for? That looks messy. And sometimes native plants can look messy. But there are certain things that you can do to avoid that. And we call these cues to care. So it's all in the aesthetics. So some of it is, being careful about your plant placement. If you put species in clusters together, so you've got 5 to 7 of one plant together, it's going to look more like a planned landscape than if you just put your species all over the place throughout. And things like putting borders, like a rock border, a mulch border, even just having a grass border, people probably won't even think twice about it, because that looks like a planned landscape. So the more natural it looks, the more people might complain about it. So anything you can do to make it look more planned, it will be more acceptable to your neighbors, which maybe that doesn't matter to you. I would highly suggest, being friends with your neighbors and having a conversation. And then another thing you might want to just double check is, local weed ordinances. If you're in the city of Holland, they've been very open to working with us and allowing rain gardens to happen. And certainly these cues to care, the city will see those as that's planned and that's purposeful. If you were to just convert your whole front yard into a native prairie, they might have an issue with that. So make sure you're checking local ordinances to make sure you're not going to be in violation of anything. All right, so I think I do have slide for questions, and I do see one question in the chat, so I'll start with that, and then if anybody has any others, if you want to pop them in the chat, or we can do them out loud. We're doing on time. Okay, so there's a question: what if a rain garden is to be in a wet area of your lawn and not near a water runoff? Do you still need an inlet and an outlet? So if you just have a low wet spot in the lawn, that may not necessarily be a rain garden per se. You could just put in native plants to take care of the water. A rain garden would be if you are purposely directing water into it. So I think some of it is just based on the need of your property. Maybe you don't need a rain garden. You just, if you want to deal with a wet spot in your lawn, you can probably deal with that by just putting in native plants, and you don't have to go through the whole excavation process and making sure you have an inlet and an outlet. But I would recommend that you investigate a little bit more as far as why is that spot wet? Is it just because it's a low spot, or is water actually moving toward that? Anybody else have questions at this point? Good. Okay. We're going to take a look at some native plants now.
I have a quick question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I had some poison ivy at the head of a ravine and I chemically removed it last fall. So how long, for instance, before I would, could I wait before I reestablish it as like perhaps a rain garden? It's a natural slope to get down there from the sidewalk on down. How long would it take for me to recover that location?
So some of that depends on the chemical that was used.
Right.
It should say on the label, like how long you need to wait. I mean, if you use something like Roundup, typically that's only a few weeks. But if you use something a little bit stronger, you may have to
I
wait
did use
longer.
Roundup.
Okay, so if it's Roundup, if it's a month later, you should be fine. It's not persistent in the soil. But again, anytime you're using an herbicide, a pesticide, the label should provide that information for you as far as, first of all, how much you should use, when you should use it, any other restrictions, but then also how long you need to wait.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, some is more persistent in the soil, but Roundup is one that tends to not be real persistent.
May I add something?
Yes.
Yes, we moved into a subdivision 6 years ago. And we were one of the first people on a small lake. And instead of running grass all the way down to the lake, I put a rain garden along the whole length of the lake of our house. And as people moved in, people put grass all the way down to the lake. But then after they lived here, and I talked to a few of them, I have about 80% of the people on the lake now with rain gardens around the lake. And every year I put plants in it that I usually get from the DeGraff Nature Center. I buy them when they have their annual sale. I add them from there. Plus I've got them from the Savannah nurseries down in Kalamazoo. But what's surprising is that once I put the natural plants in that would grow in wet areas, birds and things would come for the seeds and everything, but they also brought other plants, the seeds from other plants. So I have a lot of volunteers of wildflowers. So I get to pick and choose whether I want to keep them or move them. So we have a whole summer, every summer we get to see what new is growing down there and decide whether we want to keep it. But every month it blooms a different color. And so people see that it isn't just weeds. And I have growing in the water, I have hibiscus that have flowers that are about 6 feet across that are pink. And so that's pretty too. But another major advantage of it is that it keeps the geese from walking up onto your lawn if you have this beautiful rain garden of plants, thick plants across your yard. So it has multiple advantages. But I'm thinking about widening it a bit. But our major reason for putting it in is people like to put fertilizers on your grass. And when it rains, the water runs across your grass with the fertilizer into the water and into the Macatawa watershed project, into the lake. And so I wanted to stop that. So this rain garden stops it and makes it sink into the ground and filters out things like that before the water goes into the lake and into the water, into Lake Michigan. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's phenomenal. And congratulations on, convincing your neighbors to drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
And now I gotta work on the other lake. There's a second lake here.
Okay. Yeah. And that's what we would refer to more as a riparian buffer strip, because then you are providing that buffer between the water and the lawn. So that, any chemicals that might be running off the lawn or sediment, anything, it would be kind of captured and trapped in those native plants. Plus, you're also helping to stabilize that shoreline. The root systems of that native plant are doing another service there and keeping that shoreline stable. And I don't know how much, if there's wave action, but they'll help protect the shoreline from waves too.
When we do, we have a rise of the lake we only have a slight rise of the lake, but sometimes that whole area is wet and soggy, and sometimes it's dry. So these plants work for both, and so we don't have to worry about that. And then when it is dry, then our sprinkler systems will water them for us.
Right. Yep.
So,
Okay. Excellent.
so that's
All right.
for people who want, when you said to water their plants in the rain gardens, if their sprinkler systems will cover it, that takes care of that.
Right. Yep. That's something to think about in the planning for sure. Yep. Okay, so that's with the time we have left, talk about some native plants here. So I've mentioned, there's lots to choose from. We talked about some of the criteria for how you make the selections, and then resources. So native plant catalogs are phenomenal resources, and I just put a couple of my favorite here. The Cardno Native Plant Nursery, they have an online catalog, so you can look at it online. Prairie Moon Nursery, I don't think they have theirs online, but if you give them your address, they will mail you a hard copy, and it's a really great resource to have on hand, even if you don't order plants from them. So I wanted to kind of go through some common rain garden species, and we'll look at some pictures. But before we do that, I do want to mention just the importance of diversity in the species that you pick. The more diverse your rain garden is, the better able it is to handle disturbance, or say, a disease or an insect comes in and eats something. So the more that you have, the less you'll notice, if something ends up dying off. But also diversity is important for a couple other reasons. Diversity above ground equates to diversity below ground. So that's in the root system structure. The roots of grasses grow a little bit differently than the roots of wildflowers. Grasses tend to grow kind of deep, where wildflowers are kind of more fibrous and spreading. So those roots will kind of fill up that space and leave less room for weeds. So if you've got a good mix of grasses and wildflowers, you're going to kind of reduce that space for weed competition. And then certainly the diversity is going to be important if you want to attract, pollinators, butterflies, those sorts of things, especially the grasses and sedges. When we're talking about butterflies, we can't forget about caterpillars. So a lot of grasses and sedges are important food sources for caterpillars. So let's take a look at some of these. So there's lots and lots of different kinds of sedges. These are a couple that are commonly used in rain gardens. I like Pennsylvania sedge. It's actually a great alternative lawn or a ground cover. It only gets about 6 to 12 inches tall, and it grows in sun, it grows in shade. It kind of likes a moderate soil condition. It won't grow in real wet soil, but there are sedges that will grow in wetter soils. So then on the grasses, a lot of our native grasses, they're prairie grasses. So they're adapted to more, dry, sunny conditions. There certainly are some grasses that will grow in wetter, shady conditions. But for the most part, a better location to put your rain garden is where it's sunny, because most of the plants are adapted to sunnier conditions. And when we say full sun, if the area gets about at least 6 hours of sunlight, then the plant should be okay there. So these are some that we commonly put in rain gardens. Prairie dropseed is a fountain grass, and it's one of these that gets a little bit bigger, needs a little bit more space. It's kind of, think of like a bushel basket. Little blue stem is one that is provides quite a bit of aesthetic appeal, because it's got this bluish tint to the grass. And then when we get the first frost in the fall, it'll turn kind of a golden reddish color. So then you've got some winter interest as well. A few other grasses. I like side oats grandma just because the seed heads are fairly decorative. And then the wild rise, so there's silky wild rye, Canada wild rye. Canada wild rye gets a very similar, this kind of fuzzy, almost foxtail-like seed head, but the wild rye will take a little bit more soil moisture. They don't need to have real dry, and even part shade also. So some of the flowers, so there are a lot of species of aster. Aster are really great to include for butterflies and pollinators because they bloom late in the season. And so then they'll certainly give you some late season interest and color in your rain garden too. And the ones that I've got on the screen here from the left, like dry conditions, New England aster is one that will take wetter conditions. So you've got a variety of asters to choose from for various conditions. Not a lot of color variability in asters. And there's a reason why most native wildflowers are either yellow or purple, and that's because that's what insects see. That's the color spectrums that insects see. So that's why flowers are that color, so that they get pollinated. There are, like the side flower and aster, there's I think another one that's more of a kind of a whitish cream color, but most are going to be a shade of blue or purple. So Liatris, or blazing star, is another one that's purple, very attractive to butterflies. And you've got a variety where rough blazing star likes it dry. The marsh blazing star, as its name suggests, likes it wet. So a good plant for that wet spot in your lawn. Really great for butterflies. And some of these too, you know, these are commonly used in rain gardens because they're also recognized. So people see those and they recognize them. That's going to be more accepted as a landscape feature. So the Rudbeckias or black-eyed Susans, these are again very highly recognized. There are some varieties here to choose from. In general, black-eyed Susans tend to be short-lived perennials, but they will readily reseed themselves. So they can get a little bit aggressive if you have kind of open area where they'll seed into and spread, but if that's what you want, just as long as you're managing your expectations. And then again, this is kind of from dry to wet. The wild golden glow will take some wetter conditions. And then cone flowers. So I put both purple and yellow on the same slide, even though they're not in the same genus, but cone flowers, again, very recognizable, important for pollinators. Plus they also have seeds that would attract birds in the winter. So you can leave their seed heads up all winter for birds. Coreopsis is another one that's commonly included. So I included this picture of tall Coreopsis for scale. It is very tall, but the prairie and sand Coreopsis are pretty small, only about 1 to 2 feet. Again, important plant for pollinators and fairly commonly included in rain gardens. And as their name implies, prairie and sand, these are more appropriate in drier conditions, but they can take that periodic flooding like a rain garden. Monarda, or the bee balms, again, pretty commonly included if you want to encourage pollinators, bees especially. One note of caution is these are in the mint family, so they can spread pretty aggressively. So you might want to put them in the middle of the garden so that they don't get out of control. And then of course the milkweeds, really important if you want to have a butterfly garden to include milkweed, since it is the sole source of food for the monarch caterpillar. And you've got some variety here too, as far as dry versus wet. Obviously the swamp milkweed you want to put in a wet situation. The one note of caution here, so butterfly weed, I mean, it's very showy, you know, very like great in a garden. In Grand Rapids, the Kelvin University has been studying a bunch of their roadside rain gardens that they're in the city right away, and the butterfly weed tend to not do very well in those conditions. Not really sure why, but might not want to, if you're thinking about doing something close to the road or the driveway, it may be a salt interaction sort of a thing, but they just have not performed as well as some other species. Okay, so that's all I had for wildflowers. And I know we're just about out of time, so I do want to mention one more thing, and then we can wrap up with some questions. Yeah, butterfly milkweed is hard to grow too. It's challenging. So I did want to end with mentioning this rainscaping program that we're developing for the Macatawa watershed. This program, there's multiple components to it. One is that we are conducting volunteer training to train people on these rainscaping practices. So that's rain gardens, rain barrels, native plants, planting trees, and riparian buffers. And then how to do site assessments for homeowners. So we'll actually take volunteers through the process of basically going through the first few steps that we talked about today, that evaluating your land piece, and then working with homeowners on their goals and objectives. So if you're interested in becoming a volunteer and going to help other people assess their property and plan rainscaping practices, you can sign up for this free training and become a volunteer. Or if you don't want to go that far, but you would really like to have a volunteer come to your house and go through a site assessment process with you, you can sign up for that right now. And as soon as we have volunteers trained, the end of April, we will assign someone to come out to your property and go through the site assessment process with you. So we're getting ready to launch all that this spring. I've got, it is already available on our website. You can sign up and we'll do some additional advertising. And I can put that information in that Google folder so everybody has it. And actually I'll put it in the, let me go ahead and stop this. I will go ahead and drop the link in the chat box now. And then we are working on a contractor training portion where we hope to take contractors through a little more advanced training that would then, we would put them on a list to be able to come out and actually do the installations of these practices. Oops, okay, let me grab that link. I'm not very good at multitasking, but I don't think I've seen any other questions come in. Does anybody have any final questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a home on Lake Huron in the Upper Peninsula, and it's a new build. My home happened to burn down. Anyways, they put in a new septic system with an elevated drain field next to the house, so it looks like a berm. Typically, I've seen up there that there's grass on top of that drain field. That's what most people do. What I'd like to do is plant some native flowers or maybe some grasses on top. But I saw in your literature that's not a recommended thing. Have you seen that done? What is your advice?
Right, so you have to be careful about that because the concern is these deep root systems. We don't want those to interfere with the drainage system. Right. So there are, seed mixes that you can get that are like native plants that are septic field friendly. And I'm trying to, and it might be even Prairie Moon that has a seed mix. So I mean, it is possible to do it, but you do need to be very careful about that species selection.
Right now, weeds are starting to grow. And so I'm thinking that's not a good thing.
Yeah, here I will drop, yeah, so it is Prairie Moon that does have, they have some seed mixes that are approved for septic systems. I'll put that link in the chat if you want to take a look at that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so they're selecting species that have don't have, real invasive root systems, so they'd be safe for putting on there. And just based on the pictures here, it looks like they're, it's got some pretty things in them. So there's some possibilities there.
There's some grass that's growing on top, and so I should be able to sprinkle a seed mix with that grass. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, with seed mixes, you want to make sure it has good contact with the soil surface. And if these, grasses could potentially interfere as far as, outcompeting, you might want to consider, removing or killing, just, doing a basic herbicide application to kill what's there first before you put the seed down, just to minimize the competition for growth.
Okay. Okay. In another question, in the back, there, in the new build, there was a lot of sand that was put down, and then there's a layer of topsoil over that. What about, I was thinking my choice is going to have to be making an elevated garden, maybe edging it with rocks or stone. Would I have to add extra soil to that then? I would. Is that what you need to do, or do I need to test how much soil I have?
Yeah, I think it does depend on how much topsoil is there, and then what you plan to do. I mean, if you wanted to just put in some native plants,
I do.
Yeah, so I mean, they would probably be fine with a sandy sub base, because
Okay.
the root systems go really deep. I mean, you're not going to be able to put enough topsoil in to satisfy most native plants, but as long as you're using, kind of the prairie species that are adapted to sandier, kind of droughty soil conditions, they should be just fine.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for answering all those questions. I do want to say, for anyone who needs to jump from the call, feel free. A few people have already dropped off because we're running a little bit over, but thank you so much for addressing the last minute questions. This is a wonderful presentation, super informative and well laid out so that people can actually execute on a plan. Does anybody else have anything that they want to say before we wrap up?
Kelly, thank you. That was a wealth of information and a real treasure trove of resources available to us, not only just through MACC, but the articles that you have in your Google Docs. They're great.
Yeah, and we did run out of time to take a look at that, but hopefully you have the link, take a look at those Google resources. And if you have a copy of the slide deck, the last slide has my contact information, so certainly feel free to email me. It's my cell phone number in there, so call me if you have questions. And if you want to have one of those site assessments done and you don't want to wait for a volunteer to be ready, I'm certainly happy to come out and take a walk through your property with you.
That is a generous offer. We appreciate your time today. HASP appreciates speakers like you to lend their knowledge and insight and expertise, especially on such a cool topic. So with that, I will close the class, and everyone have a wonderful day. It's almost, well, yeah, I was going to say it's almost the weekend, but it's only Wednesday. No, this is my last day working this week. That's why I almost said that. Anyway, everybody have a wonderful day. And Kelly, if you don't need anything else from me, we can go ahead and wrap.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Kelly.
Thanks,
You're
Sarah.
welcome.
Take care.
You too.